Welcome, everybody, to the Saltzman Lecture. Linton Brooks is going to tell us a little bit about what the Saltzman Lecture is and offer a prayer, and we will work from there.
Thank you. The Salzman Lecture is named after a longtime Lewisville parishioner named Howard Salzman. In his professional life, he worked for the Organization of American States. But in his church life, he was known for three particularly strong focuses. One was the question of faith and public policy. One was the question of Christian education, and the other was the question of church governance. When Howard died, a number of his admirers came together to endow an annual lecture. The first lecture was in 1995, and for Reverend McKinley, who I know you're associated with the Sojourners. Our second lecture was Jim Wallace. And we have continued the tradition, normally in person, but recently in Zoom, in order to both honor Howard, but more importantly, honor those three broad areas which we think deserve constant thought. And with that, I wonder if you join me in prayer. Almighty and most merciful God, you have created the world, and you created your people to be one with each other and one with you. But we are not. We fall to divisions, we fall to name calling, we fall to stigmatizing people by the color of their skin, by their ethnicity, by their gender. Help us as we listen to our speakers tonight to be drawn back to that vision of life with you, in which your word is enough to bring us together. We ask this in the name of your ultimate word, Jesus the Christ. Amen. Kathy?
Amen, and thank you, Linton. So welcome again. I'm Kathy Saunders. I'm chair of the Adult Education Committee at Lewisville Presbyterian Church, and we're delighted to have you all with us. We're especially delighted to have with us Dr. Charles Chavis and Reverend Terrence McKinley, who will join in a conversation titled Hidden in Full View, Confronting the Legacy of Racism in the Age of Fracture. As I said before, I'll do brief introductions, then we'll have a short film that introduces Dr. Chavis's work, though I highly recommend getting the book, and we now have that link in the chat if you would like to learn more. So to introduce our speakers, Dr. Charles L Chavis Jr. is an author, filmmaker, activist, and professor. In other words, he's very busy. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, The Silent Shore, The Lynching of Matthew Williams, The Politics of Racism in the Free State, which was praised by Cherilyn Ifill, president of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, as a story that resonates with power and caution for our contemporary efforts to address racial violence and discrimination. The Silent Shore is currently being adapted into a documentary series. Dr. Chavis is Director of African and African American Studies, founding director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and assistant professor of history and conflict resolution at George Mason University. Dr. Chavis is national co-chair for the United States Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Movement, and vice chair of the Maryland Lynching, Truth, and Reconciliation Commission. He also serves on PBS's Exploring Hate Advisory Committee. Reverend Terrence McKinley is the Director of Racial Justice Mobilizing at Sojourners and Senior Pastor at Campbell AME Church in Washington, D.C. which is in the Anacostia area, another historic congregation. So we welcome the pastor of one historic congregation to the virtual version of our historic congregation. He served on the ministerial staff at Reed Temple AME Church, where he launched the Moral Agenda Summit hosted at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and helped design and launch the congregation's Commission on Social Action. He is an alum of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where he earned his bachelor's degrees and holds honors, and of Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey, where he earned his Master of Divinity degree. So welcome to both of you, and I am going to begin by sharing my screen to show the film. So give me just a minute to make sure that I have that working.
I would say about a little past Walnut Street. All on one side of the street were black people, families. And all on the other side of Poplar Hill Avenue were white. But everybody got along good. Children, if they had children, we played together. We didn't go to school together, but we played together. That was our environment that we had to live in. Everybody still had to try to get along with each other, regardless of what had happened.
I had no clue when I stumbled on those boxes at the Maryland State Archives that I would uncover a story that impacted a community such as this.
I heard about it through someone who was looking at archives in the Somerset Herald, where I used to work. It's one of the oldest papers in the state of Maryland. And the girl was doing a piece on the lynching. And then that's when I started questioning some of the family members that I thought would knew about it. So I think that it was tragic. Blacks did not talk about it at all. All the articles in the Somerset County paper were deleted. You didn't find any record of that. So I think the black community was just scared. I think they felt that they didn't have a voice, couldn't fight the system. They controlled everything. They basically controlled the black community. In that sense, you better not speak up.
This is the building right here, Wacomico Hotel, across the street from where Matthew Williams was lynched. We know that there was so much activity at the hotel that was going on the night of the lynching. We know that there was a football game in town. There was two teams, rival teams from the area in town. And so there were thousands of people here. And what we don't oftentimes discover is that there were black workers here who saw their classmate, their friend, a member of their community being lynched.
Everybody had to stay in. We had to stay in the house. You could not go out.
One journalist who braved the racial terror of the day was Paul Henderson of the Baltimore Afro-American. And because of Paul Henderson, we have actual evidence from the actual lynching and the rope that is referenced in the witness accounts, the rope that Chief Greer provided the mob for Williams to be lynched with is actually on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, this oil-soaked rope. And based on the historical photographs, the lynching would have taken place right around this area. A Pinkerton detective agent, who we now know walked these streets in Salisbury, as Patsy Johnson. Because of his journal, his daily accounts, we know who the members of the mob were. On this ground that we stand is the actual marker that was dedicated to Matthew Williams by the Equal Justice Initiative and the Lynching Memorial Task Force, which I've had the honor to work alongside the Salisbury Lynching Memorial Task Force. If we're brave enough, as this community has been, to confront this history, to deal with this history, to wrestle with it, to sit in it, then we can all realize justice and hopefully equality.
Well, good evening, everyone. Truly, it is an honor to be with you this evening for such an important occasion. I want to just, first of all, salute you for your resilience during this time where we are still socially distant and apart from one another, and your commitment to this ongoing lecture, and also to the subject that we are discussing tonight. Tonight is intended to be a conversation, and I am looking forward to having the chance to lead us off with just a few of those questions, but I do want to just lift up how important what we're doing tonight is. Telling these stories, the stories of Matthew Williams, is absolutely critical to the work that we need to do in the country right now. Let me also first just take an opportunity, point of personal privilege, to say how much of an honor it is to be joining and interviewing my colleague, Dr. Charles Chavis, who has done remarkable work in the state of Maryland and is a co-lead on the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. It's an honor to be with you, Dr. Chavis, tonight as well. Why don't we go ahead and jump into the meat of the matter? I'll introduce a few questions. And just once again, my name is Reverend Terrence McKinley, Director of Racial Justice at Sojourners and the Senior Pastor of Campbell AME Church in Washington, D.C. Let me jump in and offer up a question for Dr. Chavis. And so, Dr. Chavis, in the absence of politics of race today, one of the things that we see in your work is that there is a simplicity to it that makes it incredibly timely. And in many ways, you're lifting up truth-telling as the first step in the work towards healing and justice. Can you say a little bit more about that and why that is a critical first step in this work?
Sure, I will. But before I do, I want to thank the congregation of Louisville and Kathy Saunders for working with me and making this happen. It's such an honor to be here. And like Reverend McKinley, I'm thankful for your congregation continuing this lecture in the midst of this pandemic. It's extremely important, and I'm honored to be even in the listed in the same conversations or sentences in some of your past lectures. And so, to your point around truth telling and why this case is so timely, I think it's important to understand the ways in which this work was birthed. And it began right around the time I was a doctoral student at Morgan State University, around the same time that Freddie Gray had been killed at the hands of police, a black man who was killed at the hands of police. And here I am, a history doctoral student who's studying racial violence and also looking at the ways in which religious leaders responded specifically to racial violence. And I began to think about this parallel. One of my first jobs while I was at the museum was actually, while I was at Morgan State, was actually at the Lillie Carroll Jackson Museum. And it's a civil rights museum that has a replica of the NAACP flag, which read, "A man was lynched yesterday." And as 6th and 7th graders would come in to this museum, they would oftentimes ask us, right around the time that Freddie Gray had been lynched, Freddie Gray had been killed, they would ask us over and over again, was Freddie Gray lynched? Does lynching still happen today? And so for me as a historian, and this is one of the reasons why I ended up in a peace and conflict studies school, I thought I really began to think and consider the ways in which we have to be able to use history as a tool to bring about change and transformation, using also museums as spaces of truth-telling and healing. And I began this journey to salvage the humanity of Matthew Williams. The reason why I decided to focus on Matthew Williams, because he's one of the most overlooked individuals in terms of the overall lynchings in Maryland. Of the 40 documented lynchings, and the number continues to grow, his case is one of the most overlooked, but I believe to be one of the most significant. Specifically, what it actually tells us about the impact that his lynching had on an actual business district and black community. Truth-telling, to your point, I gave you the long-winded answer, but truth-telling, to your point, it's essential and it's very basic. And one of the reasons why I take this basic approach is because I want everyone to be able to understand this story. Oftentimes, black people throughout this country, we only have the oral tradition or the oral stories passed down, right? And these stories, in many ways, just like we see with Tulsa, the case in Oklahoma, it's not believed, right? People argue constantly about the numbers. Was it 300? Was it 20? Was it 40? Right? And I sought out with this work to utilize the documents that I discovered to salvage the humanity and reconstruct this story and create a more clear story, a more truthful story, and also to investigate this case, which the local law enforcement and state failed to do. And I wanted to gift that to this family and to the community. And it wasn't until right around the last year of finalizing my book that I was able to identify the descendants of Matthew Williams 90 years later. So thank you so much for that question, Reverend McKinley.
No, thank you so much. And as a follow-up, in your book, you talk about how white supremacy often thrives off of the suppression of narratives. And in many ways, your book is not just about this particular instance of racial terror, but it's also an exploration into the revealed truth of what has happened in this case. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. One of the things that I alluded to in the film briefly, and that's one of 8 episodes that we'll be putting out as we continue to engage with the community and this family and this story. I talk about the boxes that I discovered. And so while I was a doctoral student, actually in between classes and teaching at the community college, I began to seek out and try to investigate this case, as I mentioned. And I stumbled upon boxes that had been hidden in the state archives for over 90 years. And they were boxes that had investigation records. They had statements from all of the eyewitnesses. And when we talk about the suppression of narratives, it's important to understand what we know about lynching, specifically about the stories around lynching and what we're allowed to do as a country, specifically around the stories of lynching. right? There's a lie that persists that I wish to dispel, this lie that lynchings took place at the hands of persons unknown. Constantly, that is constant throughout the 6,300 and more lynchings that have been documented. We hear that consistent refrain over and over again. And for me, I sought out to dispel that lie and dispel that myth and to really try to find out the truth. And so I discovered these records after, several attempts in trying to find the story, and there were boxes hidden, as the film is titled, Hidden in Full View, for over 90 years. And they had photographs, statements from eyewitnesses, and they also included a journal from a Pinkerton detective agent who infiltrates the mob over a 3-month period, identifying the local sheriffs, police chief, city police chief, state's attorney, as well as judge, who were all complicit in this case. And if I had not found those boxes, this lie would continue to live, right? And it speaks to, again, this is one case. I like to always remind people, this is one out of the more than 6,300 documented cases and the story and the documents I'm able to utilize to reconstruct this story are essential. But again, if I had not found those documents, the story, we would never know the truth. And we would never know the truth of this story, but also what happened to this community, which is also equally as tragic. And one of the things that the film doesn't exactly get to, but is detailed in the book, and why I keep talking about the community, is because at the time that Matthew Williams was lynched, he was a part of a black community known as Georgetown, a black business district. And this is very consistent with what we see across the country. We know that Greenwood in Tulsa was the black business district. Durham had Wall Street in Durham, North Carolina. And this was consistent, similar community in Salisbury. And this was Matthew Williams' community. And as I began to do my investigation, I recognized that this lynching was really the the match that lit the fire to destroy his community. And in 1931, when Matthew Williams was lynched, there were 19 black businesses and homes in the Georgetown community. To this day, there's only one building that remains of this community. Even the bodies in the black cemetery were exhumed. Recognizing this, and in the film you hear from some of the survivors who witnessed this, it makes this story so much more real. And I think we have to begin to recognize the direct line that can be drawn from the anti-black racial terror of old to the systemic policies and practices that are allowed to thrive and to continue hidden in full view, right? And it's really rooted in the suppression of the narrative and the voices of those who witness these injustices.
And that's such a critical point that you lift there, that people often believe that lynchings took place by persons who wore hoods or were unknown, and that's not the case. That's one of the truths that comes from Matthew Williams' story. It certainly forces us to think differently about what it meant for him to exist in this community, and then ultimately experience being killed by this same community. I'm wondering, as we've been talking about sort of the importance of storytelling, truth-telling, storytelling for justice, for advancing racial healing, I'm wondering if you can offer up for our audience today thoughts about what the best ways are for persons who may not be familiar with Williams' story to then invite, be able to tell that story, or those who may not be familiar with the state of Maryland's history around lynching. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about how they can begin to invite others into that story and understanding its importance.
Sure. So, of course, the film series that we're doing, but also the work that we're doing with the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission is essential. As I mentioned, there are at least 40 documented lynchings, and we'll be having hearings throughout the state of Maryland truth and reconciliation style hearings that will take place in each of the counties where lynchings actually happened. We'll actually be having a historical trauma workshop that social workers will be guiding and leading as we prepare for our second hearing in person in Harford County, Maryland. You can learn about our work there, but also, as I mentioned, the film is going to be an extremely important tool as well. I'll be taking a group of students on the week of March 14th to Salisbury to actually begin the interviewing process of additional descendants, but also we'll be breaking ground and working with our team of social workers, and we'll be actually begin interviewing the descendants of perpetrators who were involved in the lynching. And this is something that we have really been we've been working towards this very diligently, but very slowly, and making sure along the way that we've consulted with social workers and the community of Salisbury. As I mentioned in the film, it's really a unique community in many ways. And as much as I want to talk about the work of the State Commission and where you can get involved, I think looking at the example of this community and what they've been able to do, both black and white, is something that's, I think, is really representative of a model that we should glean from. The mayor there has welcomed this work and welcomed this activism, and has devoted himself to really dealing with these issues. Of course, not always agreeing with the local activists, but working towards the goal and being able to sit at the table. And so for me, I see hope in this community and the community of Salisbury. They actually decided to establish a truth commission locally in the city, based on this work, investigating what happened to this community, and producing remedies to support the descendants. And so there's a number of ways that people can get involved and learn more about the story. But one of the best ways and the most comprehensive accounts of this Matthew Williams story is in my book, of course, but there'll be more about him as well coming out in the films that we'll be producing.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'd like to, you talk a little bit about the lynchings not being about individuals, but about dismantling the Black community. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So Sherilyn Eiffel, someone who I've really gleaned from her support and throughout this process, talks about lynchings being message crimes, right? And I say this in the book. Lynching, when Matthew Williams was lynched, it wasn't just, in many ways, it was a symbolic lynching, and in that, as lynchings were, in that it put the entire Black community on notice. And I think it's important when we think about those who deny the realities and existence of systemic racism, we look at and examine this case as a case that really shows us what this legacy looks like, right? We talk about confronting the legacy of racism, confronting racism in the age of fracture, but we're only able to confront it properly, specifically when we have a case such as this that is clearly, like I said, lined out. It begins with the lynching of Matthew Williams, and it can be tracked to this day. As I mentioned, there's a direct line between this lynching and the anti-Black violence that we continue to see, specifically in this community, but also throughout this country. I talked about the dispossession of land and all of these things that systemically happen. And I think it's important to understand, as I mentioned, these are strategies that were employed throughout the country, right? And the reason why we chose Salisbury is because it was, hidden in full view in many ways, and kind of dwarfed to the more popular and more well-known cases like Tulsa, Rosewood, and others, right? We want to show people that this is happening, and this is a strategy that's taking place in Black communities throughout this country, throughout the 20th century. And so it's connected that way through land dispossession, but it's also through the outcomes. Systemic racism, it's important for us to understand, is about outcomes, right? And we think about the bustling Black business district at this time. They had a bank, they had their own stores, they had their own community. As I mentioned, to this day, there's only that one building that the film was actually shot in, the Charles Chipman Cultural Center. And ironically, this is a church built by former slaves in 1837. And this is the only building, as I mentioned, and the extent to which this process played out through the various tools within the repertoire of the local and state and federal government is extremely detrimental. But it also, as I mentioned, in regards to outcome, it's represented the outcomes. The juvenile incarceration rate per capita in Wacomico County is higher than that in Baltimore City. You have black businesses who are denied at a much more denied business licenses at an astronomical rate than their white counterparts. There's still this oppression and socioeconomic gap and poverty that is really over this community. There's investigations into the local detention centers by the Department of Justice since for the past 30 years, right? And so when we think about these episodes, right, of in history, you know, we hear the constant refrains. This is so long ago. You know, for people in the black community and people throughout this country, black and brown people, these things are very present in their minds. And I sought out with this work to really validate their stories and to shine a light on their stories and to provide them with an opportunity to witness someone and witness a process that really spoke to their humanity, right? And that's one of the reasons why the investigation piece was important, because a lot of them were never given, you know, all the 6,200 cases, because of the corruption within law enforcement. None of them had a proper investigation. There were no proper investigations. There was no analysis, and if there were, they were suppressed for whatever reasons.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And let me just pause and say, one of the things that we were hoping for is that this would be a conversation. And so I'm going to direct a couple more questions to Dr. Chavis, and then I'm going to create an opportunity to open up for others to ask questions. I see some of you are writing, and I know many of you are thinking about what you've already seen, and some of you may have already had interacted with his work. And so want to let you know that we'll provide that opportunity in just a moment. Dr. Chavis, I am happy to hear you sort of reference Greenwood and Tulsa. And so I had an opportunity to interview around the 100th anniversary some of the remaining descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre back just this past year, less than a year ago, and authored a piece called Refusing to Erase the Tragedies of the Past, and was particularly taken by how that descendant talked about what it meant to grow up in Tulsa and the uniqueness of her experience being a Tulsan, multi-generations, having several generations that have lived in Tulsa before her, and knowing that this is a part of their story. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this from a local perspective, right? What does the story of Matthew Williams mean? What does it contribute to our conversation about the stories of the past, and what does this story of his community represent as well?
Thank you, Rev, for that question. That's one of the things I actually wanted to talk about, because in the film you'll see two individuals who are so dear to my work and to me. Miss Audrey Matthews. We recently identified Miss Audrey Matthews. She's 94 years old. And we also will be interviewing a 98-year-old descendant and survivor of the incident who will talk about her experiences. But one of the things that you didn't see in the film was Miss Audrey Matthews. During her hour-and-a-half interview, she talked about this Georgetown community. We were astonished because even though this community is erased, and with her being in her 90s and quite ill, she made her way to the church where she once sat as a child and recalled from where individuals sat. She talked about experiences as a child there, but one of the most remarkable things that during her interview was when she discussed her community, the pride that she had in her community. And she talked briefly about her memories of her family reflecting on the night of the lynching, but she really was not that emotional. What made her the most emotional was when she began to talk about the dismantling of her community, this process. She talked so vividly about, and you saw the photographs, and this was the community that she remembered, and she talked about the process of this dismantling and how over the years, as time went by, homes were just, it was like they came in one by one, but for various reasons to take their land, and it's extremely traumatic. Miss Shani Shields, who is an actual local activist, civil rights activist, her grandfather was an eyewitness to the lynching. Matthew Williams was his classmate, and Sherilyn Ifill had been doing research on this case as a result of her work around trying to get legal support and, in a sense, reparations for the descendants of Georgetown. She was not able to get Miss Shani Shields to talk. Right. The reason why my book is called The Silent Shore is because for years, even to this day, members of the Black community won't talk about this because of the trauma, right? And Shani points that out in her reflection. Ms. Shields points that out when she says that we work for the people who are in the mob, right? So I think people don't want to deal with that, and why this case is so powerful is because the same people that were in power historically are the same families and names that continue to hold these positions of power over the community. The mayor actually gave a radio interview after reading my book, and I had kept this book from the mayor, and I only actually allowed the local activists and the descendants to view the materials. I did not want this to get out. I kept this very close to me, and he actually admitted in the interview after reading my book that to the white community that we have some reckoning to do, because in this book everyone knows these families, everyone knows the names, they have prominent roles, and it's something that we're going to have to confront and deal with. So it speaks to, we think about the local community, both Black and white. There's a silence in many ways on part of the Black community as a result of this continued unrelenting systemic control. But to see a community 90 years later still fearful to bring up this case, that was something that was difficult to deal with as I engaged the community, right? And we're really, as I mentioned, moving delicately as we move forward to work with and interview the descendants of perpetrators who we've been able to identify and who have agreed to speak.
It's powerful. You are a man of faith, strong faith. I know that your faith informs your work and how you approach what you do and how and why you do what you do. Why don't you share with us how indeed your faith is tied into your work, has led you to this work, how it informs and shapes the work that you're doing now as a scholar?
Well, early on, I felt like this was a divine process as I stumbled upon these boxes and began to, continue time after time after, really feeling like giving up around salvaging this story, what happened to Matthew Williams. I think I saw very on that I had a little bit of help. And that really encouraged me throughout this process. But also, what I think in terms of my faith, the power of the truth, right? I think about the scripture, and the truth that we know shall make us free. And I think it's very difficult, as we all know, in America, in many ways, for us to really deal with the raw truth and realities of what some of the most marginalized people in our community, in our country, have witnessed. We want to believe in this unified America, and we don't want to deal with the messy and difficult episodes and experiences within our story. It's very similar to what I feel like in terms of the story of Jesus, right? It's easy for us to think about all the miracles and the amazing things that he's done, but what the bad things and the things that he went through and experienced, right? I think so that for me is something that I think is essential, even in the way I approach moving forward with this work, right? I think people look at this book and they're like, oh, another book on lynching, another book on terror, but I feel like this is in fact another book on truth, right? This is a book on truth and what the utility of truth specifically, and really is a roadmap in the beginning for the process and moving towards racial healing and transformation. For so many years, as I mentioned, people like Miss Cheney and Miss Audrey Matthews and the descendants of Matthew Williams have been silent, and their stories have been ignored. I really wanted to shine a light on their stories and this truth. And I feel that, like I said, it's essential to us moving forward. And it's something that's important about Matthew Williams' story as well is, and the way I lay out the book is, the shared humanity, because that's what a lot of this is about, right? The shared humanity. We oftentimes, if we're allowed, we allow the system, both black and white and other, we allow the system to extract the humanity of individuals, specifically because of alleged crimes, right? And at the end of the day, I think what I wanted to do is show the humanity of Matthew Williams, the humanity of his community, and really let others know, we're better than this as a community, but also as a country, and we have to be able to deal with this raw truth, right? Because Black and brown people have been dealing with this truth for hundreds of years, right? And so I really want the truth of this story and this story to help us to move along this process and begin this work that has to be done.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up for some questions. But based upon your research and work, what do you see now as the biggest threat to the work of racial healing and social justice?
Well, it's really the threat on the truth. I mean, that is the biggest attack. I mean, especially as a historian, I would never see myself as being, thinking about, wanting to be a historian and wanting to teach, seeing myself in such a politically volatile situation, but also to see history being politicized in the manner that it has been, right? And so, this assault on truth, and this attempt to use a Trojan horse of sorts, which we see in Virginia, this critical race theory, which I think is really a Trojan horse, really designed to stifle the important and impactful conversations about some of the, again, more contentious, divisive issues and experiences that people of color have faced in our country, right? And we have to stamp this out, and we have to deal with it. And I think for me as a scholar, an educator, this is something that I'm committed to doing in any way possible. And, so I think this assault on truth telling and truth at every level is something that we have to continue to be on watch and on guard for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chavis. And so I'm going to take an opportunity to open up the floor to others who may want to direct questions to Dr. Chavis based on the conversation or the film that you've watched. Why don't you go ahead and use the raised hand feature, which is right at the bottom of your Zoom. You can just go ahead and hit the reactions button, and you'll be able to raise your hand. If you're on audio or calling in from a phone, then we will, I don't know if you'll all have that same feature, but if you just come off of mute, you can signal to us and we'll go ahead and turn it on. Okay. Even as my phone goes off.
Right. I have a question if others are still thinking. But yes, please do use the, Linton also does. Okay, so I will start with mine, and I gave Dr. Chavis a little bit of a warning of this one because I'd been thinking about it when I was reading through the book. I began to notice another silence or gap, and namely, there is a lot about the Wesley Church, the Black church, which is clearly a center of community support and resistance. I saw very little about the white churches in town, and I suspect that's because they were part of the conspiracy of silence, but I'd sort of like to have that confirmed. And I'm also wondering, and there may be a partial answer in that I realize this information is quite new to many of the white residents of Salisbury, but I'm wondering if they are doing any reckoning, if any of them are still around, if they're doing any reckoning with their part in this history.
Thank you so much for that question, Kathy. And so, yes, to your point, for the most part, the majority of the white community, specifically white religious leaders, were silent and also, if not silent, complicit in this lynching. There was actually a report by Brodus Mitchell, who's an economics professor at Hopkins at the time, who was also a member of the National Council of Churches, Federation of Churches, and they actually came in and did their own investigation into the lynching, and they revealed again a lot of the similar things that I kind of revealed in terms of the ways in which it was pre-planned. There was locals involved, and there was actually a rabbi in Maryland, in Baltimore, who called out the clergy on the Eastern Shore for being so silent while in discussing this lynching. And so there was almost like a theological debate that ensued right after the lynching that I don't get into the book regarding the inaction and also the failure of religious leaders, Christian faith leaders, to speak out against these injustices. But as I mentioned, a lot of the individuals who were involved were a part of these congregations, and in many ways these congregations, some of them were in support of this lynching. It's also important to understand that there were whites, and this is why truth telling is so essential, and why it's problematic and wrong when we erase this history. Again, if I had not found these records and documents, we would never know about whites who were on the right side of history. Right, and that's something that I point out as well in my book, specifically the case of Miss Marie Waller, whose family we have worked with. Marie Waller was a nurse in the ward when Matthew Williams was actually lynched, and we have a video interview that she gave around the time of her death in 2014, and she was in her late 90s, and she, for the first time, recalled the night and talked about the cowardice of the other nurses who just, who were sworn to protect their patients, who did nothing. And she talks about her experiences that night. But then we also have a white laborer whose story is really essential. It's very minimal in the book, but it was very powerful and telling to me. He actually, again, these lynchings were pre-planned. And so he was working in a factory on the Eastern Shore, and the call went out to the local white males about this lynching, and the boss let everyone off to go participate. And this individual refuses. He's a white man. He refuses, and he says he doesn't say whether or not he's in support or he's against. He clearly says, "I just want to stay and work." And as a result, him and his wife are testifying to the state's attorney and others, and they show him the pink slip that he received the next day. He was fired from his job that next day during the Great Depression. This is 1931, right? And so again, in suppressing the truth in these stories, we'll never know of those who spoke out, right? And so that's what's also equally as problematic when we do that. And so hopefully that answers your question, Kathy. But yeah, it was very difficult. And I think as a faith leader, as a faith, I would say not a faith leader, but someone of faith. I'm gonna give that to Reverend Terrence. It was difficult for me to see these correspondence back and forth, right? But there were white leaders who spoke out clearly. Some religious leaders, Christian faith leaders, who spoke out as well in Baltimore and throughout the state against these actions of the Eastern Shore.
Linton Brooks has his hand up.
Yes. I'm I'm still a little stunned, even recognizing the long history of lynching in this country. In the cases I have looked at in the past, which is nothing like the extensive research you've done, there's at least some claim about the victim. You know, Emmett Till whistled, others tried to vote. But if I understand you, this guy essentially was chosen because he was black and he was locked up in a place where they knew where he was going to be and they could go get him. Is that correct? And did that, it would seem to me that that would be even harder for religious groups of the day to justify. Could you say a little more about that?
Sure, and I can go into kind of detail of exactly what happened. So Matthew Williams was accused of actually killing his employer. That was what it was about, right? And it's also important to understand the context. And one of the reasons why I chose this lynching is because of what was going on at this time. A lot of my work and research centers around the correlation between economic strife and racial violence. So when we think about this from a historical perspective, and the numbers around racial terror, it's always around these times of racial economic tension and strife that we have this uptick. So post enslavement, we have Reconstruction, when the Klan emerges, formalizes this terror. In the 1890s, we have the economic depression. That's where we have the height of in terms of lynching. And again, in 1929, at the time, in the beginning of the Great Depression, we have another uptick. It's not as dramatic as that of the 1890s, but it happens again. And so the original issue with Matthew Williams was that he was accused of killing his employer, but in investigating the case and hearing from white witnesses again, their oral history accounts and other accounts, it became quite clear that the true story was actually that DJ Elliott, who was the individual who Matthew Williams had allegedly killed, his son was a gambler and had a number of issues, and he had borrowed money from Matthew Williams, who again during the beginning of the Depression, one of the things I talk about in the book about his humanity, he had money in 2 bank accounts. He was extremely successful. He was a hard worker, and he had allowed the son to borrow money, and he after the son refused to repay him, he went to the father to get his funds, right, and get his money. And the son met him there and shot. The story goes that he shot the father and then turned the gun on Matthew Williams. And he would spend the majority of his life in an institution, the son, following this. And I'm able to kind of document the rationale in this story. But what's ironic about the documents and the statements, it's quite clear that Matthew Williams is innocent when we have a lot of the witnesses and those who were involved, including the fire chief, as I mentioned, who provided the rope, and others. We have open confessions documented in the Journal of the Pinkerton agent. One of the things that's often talked about very commonly in these records, that blacks on the Eastern Shore they had it coming. It didn't matter who it was, that we were getting someone, right? And again, during this time, people are also thinking about, in terms of the context, the Scottsboro Boys, which is a more famous case, is happening in Alabama. You have a national attack on black laborers that's happening. And there were also a number of near lynchings and acts of terror targeted at black communities on the Eastern Shore. And so one of the things that Professor Sherilyn Ifill admonishes, me and others who do this research, she admonishes us to make sure that we don't allow those who didn't get the job done a pass, right? And so we always want to talk about, we have a low amount of lynchings, but terror is still terror, and black communities, because white communities aren't able to get the job done and to finalize the work, doesn't mean the trauma is not there. And that's something that I wanted to be very clear about in this book. And I'm able to document as well near lynchings that took place beginning in 1929 all the way into the 40s, continued in Maryland. And something that a lot of that we just received in terms of information. We've received an additional 40 cases of racially motivated homicides that we'll be investigating that date from 1930 to 1970 in this state, including a potential massacre that took place about 15 minutes from where Matthew Williams was lynched.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis. And I know we're drawing to a close, but I'm going to direct one last question to you. But before I do, let me just express my thanks once again for the opportunity to be with you all and to participate in this conversation. Personally, as I'm listening to this conversation about the Eastern Shore and Salisbury, I had an opportunity to participate in the 100-mile Seagull Century, which takes place right in Salisbury, Maryland. It's known for hosting that very special ride this past year in 2020. And it's special to hear about sort of this legacy of the Eastern Shore after experiencing so much of it in that just a few months ago. I do want to just ask Dr. Chavis, we are experiencing a lot in these days, and with the pandemic, with the racial justice crisis reckoning that has happened since the summer of 2022, with the January 6th insurrection and the ongoing impacts of that insurrection, the threat to our elections, and this conversation about truth and the big lie that has continued to permeate. I'm wondering if you can maybe say a word about your sense of what the national mood is at this time, and whether or not this is the time for our country to have a national commission, the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission.
Sure. Thank you, Terrence. I think it's high time for America to have a Truth Commission. And again, the story of Matthew Williams is one of thousands of stories, just like the story of Tulsa is one of hundreds of stories of Black communities throughout this country that were dismantled. Whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the ways in which our country were in many ways conceived in racism, anti-Blackness, and sexism. Right? It's something we don't want to talk about and deal with, but we have to deal with the outcomes that continue to show up, right? In the classes that we excluded originally, and the communities that we've excluded originally, right? We have to deal with that. And again, the best way to do that, I mean, we've supported and given money to truth commissions throughout the globe. If America is going to heal, we have to really begin to have a conversation and a process, and it needs to happen at a national level. But I also think it's important to understand the importance of the local as well. And much of this work, the important work of justice and racial healing and social transformation are local, right? And it begins at the local level. And so I think we need a commission nationally. We have to have it. It's very essential. I feel like there's a powder keg brewing up, and there's just so much confusion, and there's and it really speaks to the current moment that we're in. We're coming out in the midst of this pandemic, and also again this unrelenting, what to many in the Black community feels to be unrelenting. Something that I did not talk about previously was the correlations in terms of numbers around lynchings and also anti-Black violence. So when we think about the question that the students asked me, was Freddie Gray lynched? Was Ahmaud Arbery? Were these people lynched? I began to do research, and in 1915 there were around 90 lynchings that took place of Black men. In 2015 there was over 115. cases where unarmed Black people were killed at the hands of police, right? And again, this we want to stamp out and say this when we see these incidents, these are bad. We have to get rid of the bad apples. But it's when this continues to happen over and again, we have to figure out ways in which and consider the ways in which our institutions, our practices, our policies may be a part of the problem. Right? We know that there's bad apples, but we have to be able to have real conversations about our institutions and our systems, because if there's any hope for us healing as a country and moving towards justice, then we have to recognize that. So I would end there, but I do see some more questions coming up as well. But I'll answer that one for you, Reverend McKinley. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we have a question for Adrian here.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. But on Dr. Chavis, on your last comments, I agree with, as I'm sure most of us do, the need for such an examination and truth telling. How do you see, what would be useful steps in that direction, given this sort of very high level, almost hatred between various components of our current political system? How can we even make progress in getting there if only one side or one of three or four sides of the issue are willing to even talk about it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's something that we've struggled with, even in terms of the work that we're trying to do towards establishing the U.S. Commission. But again, I'm hopeful for examples like those in Salisbury, Maryland. And I'm going to give this example because it's really important. The city is, quite progressive, at least I would say the mayor is quite progressive, excuse me, but the county itself is hyper conservative, very conservative. I believe actually the former President Trump spoke there. It was very, isolated, and it was really politically charged environment. But they found a way, right, as a community, recognizing the ways in which this story and this experience really impacted this Black community. They found a way to deal with it and work through this. It was difficult, but I think we have to begin again at the local level. We can't get caught up in the politics that we're seeing in the national sense. I think communities have to empower themselves and be able to have these conversations, these real conversations, but the victims need to be supported, the descendants of victims need to be supported in the process, but it has to begin at the local level. And, whites who may not have been involved, but who want to move towards justice and support this cause for justice, that should be a part of this process. But I think, like I said, what I've seen, the interracial group that has emerged in Salisbury is something that gives me a tremendous hope, because specifically, once they began recognizing specifically members of the white community, how they had more in common, right, which is what's consistent with what I talk about in the book, with those who may be a different race than them locally, than they did with the politicians who may nationally be attempting to divide, right? And that's a lot of what we see, even in the ways in which I investigate this case. We see the element of class and how it is used to divide those who have, again, more in common than they do, different. And so that's, I think, important for us to recognize. But again, it begins at the local level, and communities have to make a decision to fight for their community and what the legacy of their community, right? And I think the acknowledgement is essential, right? You can't just, I'm a big proponent of these symbols, and the work of Brian Stevenson that he's doing with the Equal Justice Initiative and the monuments and markers, right? This symbolic reconciliation is important, but acknowledgement, right, in terms of the institutions is also essential. Because we know that lynchings were state sanctioned, we need to have those who carry on the mantle of those who were directly involved and connected in these cases to acknowledge, right, the injustices on the part of their their previous predecessors, right? That's very important. And I think that's what makes Salisbury again a unique case, because the mayor and other officials are coming out and owning this as a white male, right? That's very essential as well. So I think it's about politicians locally who really want to do this work and focus on this work, but it's also about communities deciding to come together to be better and to embrace this truth and move towards something that towards healing and social transformation, and really towards a better community.
Yeah, and I would
Appreciate
just add on that point, from my perspective as a pastor and a faith leader who's leading in the faith space, two ways that we talk about this. One, the notion of the beloved community, that we have to have a vision of ourselves and our country, our nation, that is a big vision. And this notion in religious terms of the beloved community, where if one person is injured, the entire community feels that injury, is, I think, an important frame, particularly for people of faith to think through. The other is the notions of faith and justice, right? That justice is to do the work of repairing one who has been harmed. And there is a quote that has stayed with me lately, and that quote is that to see what is right and to see what is wrong and not to do something about it is to either lack courage or to lack principle. And I think this moment demands of us that we act with both principle and courage in order for us to begin these very important conversations. I do want to surface there are comments in the chat for those of you who haven't seen them, but the one comment from Lewinsville 4, if America is going to heal, we have to have these conversations locally with a central commission, and also thanking Dr. Chavis. And I don't know, Dr. Chavis, if you want to say any more about that, but you did speak about that.
Yes, definitely. I think Kathy had a question, or
No, I don't at the moment. Actually, one of my questions was what faith communities could do, and I think Reverend McKinley just answered that very nicely. Yeah. And I can't remember who's on Lewinsville 4. You could identify yourself maybe. I suspect one of our staff or pastors who can't be speaking right now for one reason or another. So yeah, but I think the whole question of how faith communities can become involved, but I think also there was a question on the floor for Dr. Chavis. So
sure, yeah. And so the faith communities, the kids, got you.
Yeah, see, it's one of our pastors who has her family. Yeah, got it. Hi, Jen, thanks.
My son's at the door trying to figure out what's going on too. No worries. So I think the faith community, one of the very important things about this commission, and with the state commission, but also with this local commission, having seats for faith leaders to be a part of this process is very essential. Both representatives of both interracial congregations, both black and white churches, is essential. And even when we think about this idea of reconciliation, and in terms of the biblical sense, it's important to understand that the power, you talk about this beloved community, that's exactly, as I mentioned previously, around why my faith is connected to this work. We have to be able to go through this troubled history to get through something that is more genuine and more just. And I think the shared humanity piece is essential as well. We have to be able to see, fight against the forces outside, the political forces and other forces that seek to divide us, and embrace the humanity in the individuals who we see are being oppressed. And I think when at a local level, again, this is just so important in witnessing this. We have to begin there and build our way out and strengthen these local efforts. Again, with the politically volatile situation we have nationally, these local efforts and movements, as most movements begin, they have to, at the local level, we have to begin there, start there.
And let me offer up one more opportunity for faith communities that Dr. Chavis is involved with over the course of Black History Month. February is Black History Month. We have been working, the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation movement has been partnered with Black Fortune Month. And Dr. Lisa Sharon Harper has been leading this effort. She's written a book called Fortune, how race broke my family, and she examines 10 generations of her own personal family story, tells that story, and how race played a part in that story over 10 generations. Church groups across the country are actually reading and having conversations about this. And as Dr. Chavis just mentioned when talking about the Matthew Williams case, noticing that many of the same families are the ones that are still those who are business owners and leaders, are the ones who are part of harms of the past. And so conversations are happening around that work. And at the end of the month, Dr. Chavis and I will be a part of some advocacy efforts that will be happening. But I just want to commend that to congregations as well. It's an opportunity to enter into this conversation through yet another story. But I think it goes back to the initial part of our conversation where we jumped off, and that is how critical and important it is for us to continue to tell these stories, to remember them, and to not lose them, because they inform who we are today and where we ought to go.
Thank you. That is, and we'll get James. I will say, Pastor Jen, who was the one in the Louisville 4 in the chat, she preached this morning and she went through some family history of her own. She's white. Having looked up where her grandparents had houses and the redlining in not in their neighborhood but nearby, and some of the comments that the people who rated those neighborhoods for mortgageability basically made about both her grandparents' neighborhoods and nearby neighborhoods, and how that. So it sounds like Lisa Sharon Harper's book would be a really interesting counterpart to the stories we heard in Jen's sermon. Oh, and Jen is there now. Jen's sermon this morning. So I will commend anybody that's available on our website if anybody wants to hear. That was an amazing sermon. So and Jen is now there. I don't know whether you want to say anything, Jen.
I've gotten a little away from Annabelle and other kids that are friends that are with her right now, so I'm a little more private now. But yeah, I did talk today about sort of 4 generations of my family's history based on being able to get loans in green lighted areas in certain parts of town with both my grandparents, and just imagining what that 4 generations to my children from my grandparents would be like versus somebody who was in a red line neighborhood, and what 4 generations in that family would be like. So that was the focus in the sermon today, and it sounds very much like that generational impact and outcome that can happen when racist policies affect somebody who doesn't look like me in a very different way.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Reverend Jean.
Yeah.
I'm going to be watching that sermon too.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for today.
It's on the website. And James Foster has a question. I'm not sure anybody can call on him who doesn't know who he is, given his somewhat turned around screen name there. But
yeah, Foster JE. That's my email. So my apologies. I don't put my name down for some reason. This was a wonderful conversation. I just want to thank everyone, and also particularly Pastor Jen for really setting the stage for tonight's discussion. I think that the real interesting part of her sermon and how it feeds into what we're talking about now is to try and connect the dots, connecting events from long ago to us now. And if that is not possible, if you don't see yourself as having connections to those things going on before, you can just turn around and walk away and say, hey, I didn't do anything. Wasn't me. And one of the key factors that allows you to know that there's a link is economics. As you put forward in your discussion, you passed over it a little bit, but I want to emphasize that. I'm an economist at George Washington University. And consequently, I see a lot of things through that light, and no doubt that it was very much on the minds of people. And at that time, the implications of making sure that the people would be put down by this, and that the property could be extracted, that the white folks could get the jobs. And, you know, you just have to realize that there's a huge economic aspect to this, which lasts to this day for all of us. So that hysteresis, the persistence of something that happened long ago to affect what's going on now, is really what has to come through, I think, very strong. The other point, I just want to make one comment, and that was that, you know, you mentioned international affairs in your discussion. I have a good friend who hops into countries and collects the stories of people who have been in the presence of atrocities, and then hops out and collects their stories and can speak on their behalf. A guy named Patrick Vink at Harvard. And it's amazing how that's the same thing as what you're doing, just through space and time. That is a really effective thing to happen in foreign countries. It's clear that what works over there can also work for us here, as we continue to tell the stories of people who can't tell our own stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Want to give people one last chance to ask questions or anything else? I think we have all learned a great deal this evening, a great deal of food for thought, and we so much appreciate both of you being here and guiding our thoughts and our conversations as we seek to think about our part in this great national endeavor, which really does need to happen and to keep happening. It will be hard work for all of us, I think. So we thank you so much, both of you, for being here. Oh, John Cluett has his hand.
May I just ask if there is a mailing list or anything that we can sign up on to be able to get further information about the video series that you're producing, or other things? If there's any sort of link or that sort of thing that you might be able to put in the chat, that would be great.
Dr. Chavis, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I can put that in the chat right now. No worries. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Yes, and I will save the chat so anybody can either get in touch with me, or if they don't know how to get in touch with me, can get in touch with Allison Lineberger, whose email address you should have. And I will make sure. So, okay, excellent there. So I think we will say thank you very much at this point, and thank everyone for coming. This was really a powerful and important conversation. And I think I will offer a brief prayer to close us, and then we will say goodnight to each other and go on into our weeks inspired. Mary, that's a clap, not a question, right? Okay, okay, good. So would you join me briefly in prayer? Lord, thank you for bringing us together here to consider some difficult history and to consider the power of truth, that the truth and your role in making truth visible and audible, and in seeing each other's humanity, knowing that we are all created in your image, and helping us to live into that truth as we go into our lives. Watch over us, help us to be inspired, but what we have heard tonight, guide us in our next steps and our next actions. Help us to hear each other, help us to hear those we might not be used to listening to as carefully as we should. Help us to hear you in all around us and hear your voice in our lives, guiding us what to do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.